Two locomotives sit less than a mile apart, both built the same decade, both pulled from active service around the same year of the same era of railway history entirely. One is under a tarp in a restoration shed, volunteers slowly stripping old paint back to bare metal by hand, one small section at a time, over a period of years. The other is stacked in a scrap yard, waiting for a crane with a hydraulic shear to cut it into sections small enough to load onto a waiting truck. Nothing about their age tells you which is which, and nothing about how they look right now would let you guess correctly either. So what actually decides that one of these machines is worth saving and the other genuinely isn't? Let's get into it right here on Small Things. Retired is not the same as worn out. A train being retired and a train being worn out are not the same event, even though people tend to talk about them as if they were interchangeable, one word standing in for the other. Plenty of retired trains can still run perfectly well the day they're pulled from service, mechanically capable of years more work under the right conditions and with the right maintenance behind them. Retirement isn't a verdict on whether a machine still functions properly. It's a decision about whether keeping it running still makes practical sense for whoever would actually have to pay for that to happen going forward. Those are two completely different questions, and almost everything that determines a train's fate afterward comes down to which one actually got answered first. One man's price. It did not begin with a debate about heritage or historical significance in some committee room. It began with a specific locomotive that British Railways had already decided to scrap outright on paper with a price attached. Flying Scotsman finished its last scheduled run in January 1963, retired after roughly 40 years of continuous service as diesel and electric power made steam locomotives increasingly expensive and impractical to keep running across the wider network. Despite its considerable fame at the time, it was not automatically saved by that reputation alone. British Railways priced it at its scrap value, roughly £3,000, and a preservation society formed specifically to buy and save the locomotive could not raise even that comparatively modest amount from public donations. The locomotive survived only because one businessman, Alan Pegler, personally paid the full asking price himself and had it restored at considerable expense entirely out of his own pocket, with no institutional backing behind him. Thousands of other steam locomotives from that exact same era found no equivalent buyer willing to step in when it mattered and went to the scrapyard instead, entirely regardless of their own individual service records or actual mechanical condition at the time they were withdrawn. Fame alone hadn't saved Flying Scotsman from that fate. A specific person deciding it was worth a specific price and actually being able to pay it had made the real difference in the end. That same basic pattern still plays out today across every kind of retired train, just with different institutions and individuals standing in for Alan Pegler each time. A railway, a museum, a heritage group, a private collector, or another operator entirely has to look at a specific retired train and make a genuine, convincing case that its value exceeds whatever it would actually cost to keep, restore, relocate, or maintain it going forward for years to come. That case has to convince someone with real money at stake, not just admiration for the machine's history or its appearance sitting quietly in a yard somewhere. When nobody manages to make that case successfully, for whatever reason, the default outcome is the scrapyard. No matter how historically interesting or visually striking the machine might be to someone, somewhere, purely in theory, history alone has never been enough to guarantee survival, then or now. What the evaluation actually weighs. So what actually goes into that evaluation process before a final decision ever gets made public, and why does a train that still runs perfectly well sometimes lose the argument anyway? Before any final decision gets made, inspectors go through a retired train, checking structural condition carefully from end to end, looking for corrosion on the frame and assessing the wear on major components like traction motors and wheel sets that have logged years of hard, continuous use. But the more decisive number in this whole process usually isn't mechanical at all. It's a straightforward cost comparison. What would keeping this specific train running actually require going forward, weighed against what a full replacement or a written-off loss would cost instead over the same period? A modern replacement part might not even be manufactured anymore for an older model, meaning a single failed component has to be custom fabricated at a price that can genuinely exceed what the entire train is worth on paper today. Newer trains also have to meet current safety and emission standards that an older design was simply never built to satisfy, and retrofitting those systems into an aging frame is often more expensive by itself than simply retiring the unit altogether. If a train passes that initial evaluation and clears the cost threshold, technicians strip it methodically for anything genuinely reusable first: traction motors, doors, seats, and control equipment, all of it carefully inspected and set aside before anyone decides what happens to the remaining shell of the vehicle. If the numbers simply don't work out in its favor, that same shell heads toward recycling instead of restoration, and steel's particular ability to be melted down and reused repeatedly without losing any real strength is exactly why scrapping remains the financially simplest option whenever nobody involved can justify spending anything more expensive on it. The evaluation itself rarely takes very long to complete. The consequences of it can last for decades either way, depending entirely on which number came out ahead. Functional isn't the same as worth it. It's easy to assume that a retired train sitting untouched for years, still parked in the same siding, hasn't yet been scrapped simply because someone quietly decided it's safe, worth keeping around indefinitely by default. That assumption gets the timeline backwards. A train can sit for a decade without anyone actively deciding anything about it at all, simply low enough on a priority list that nobody has gotten around to evaluating it yet one way or the other. Surviving this long was never actually proof of a decision in its favor. It was just proof that nobody had made a decision at all yet. The opposite assumption causes just as much confusion in the other direction, that anything old enough to look genuinely historic will obviously get preserved by someone, somewhere, eventually, almost automatically. Restoration isn't a formality that simply kicks in once a train looks impressive enough sitting quietly in a yard. It requires real money, physical space, specialized expertise, and a long-term maintenance commitment that doesn't end the moment the paint job is finished and photographed for the public. Flying Scotsman itself is proof of how real that gap can be, saved only because one private buyer happened to step in after an entire preservation society had already failed. Most retired trains never get an Alan Pegler. They get a spreadsheet, a deadline, and whatever answer the numbers on it happen to produce that week. People making the call. An inspector runs a gloved hand along a locomotive's underframe, checking corrosion carefully with a small pick that taps a hollow, flaking sound out of metal that used to ring solid years earlier when the unit first entered service fresh from the factory, noting the exact spot on a clipboard before methodically moving on to the next joint further down the frame. A fleet manager walks the yard with a clipboard on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, counting how many sidings a retired unit has occupied for months now, that a new order of replacement cars badly needs somewhere to sit once they finally arrive next spring, and realizes the real cost isn't sitting on any repair invoice at all, it's the space itself, already spoken for by something that hasn't even shown up yet. At a coastal dock, workers carefully strip the wheels, doors, and interior wiring from a retired subway car before it gets loaded onto a waiting barge bound for open water offshore. part of a program that eventually sank more than 2,000 stripped New York City subway cars off the Atlantic coast to become artificial reefs instead of ordinary scrap metal. In a restoration shed on a quiet weekend, a volunteer wire brushes rust from a boiler casing that hasn't moved under its own power in over a decade now, working steadily from a parts list where half the listed components haven't actually been manufactured by anyone in decades either. A number, not a birthday. An old train is not saved simply because it can still run, and it is not scrapped simply because it has reached a certain age or a certain birthday on paper. Its fate depends entirely on whether a railway, an operator, or the public can still find enough value in what it is right now or in what it could realistically become next with enough investment behind it. Somewhere right now, a similar machine is being evaluated by someone holding a clipboard, and the outcome will come down to a specific number, not sentiment and not a birthday. Trains don't retire the moment they stop moving under their own power. They retire when nobody left in the entire system around them has a genuine, practical reason to keep them moving anymore. If this changed the way you look at a retired train sitting in a yard somewhere, let us know in the comments below what you want us to explore next in a future video. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.